February 17, 2011. We are interviewing Andrée Alien Brooks in Westport, Connecticut. My name is Agnes Vertes, and the camera operator is Julian Reitman, and we are the Jewish Historical Society of Southern Fairfield County. Would you please introduce yourself?
Andrée Alien Brooks. I live in Westport. I've been here since 1973. I raised my children here. I have an office attached to my house where I do my writing and research.
May I ask you where and when you were born?
I was born in London, in England, in 1937.
Where did you go to school?
I went to school in London. If you're looking at elementary school, for a few years I was in the north of England when the end of the Second World War, but after that in London. I went to a place called Queen's College, which was a private or public school, we called them there, in the centre of London. And then I apprenticed to a newspaper in London and went and took college courses in connection with the four-year program in journalism, training to be a newspaper reporter.
When did you come to the United States?
As I finished that program, I was 21, I think.
And where did you arrive in the United States?
In New York. I'd been here for a year when I was a teenager. My father had been here on business, so I was not coming to a strange place. I started out taking a room at the 92nd Street Y, where they had a lot of hostel accommodation for young people at that point in time. I don't know if they still do it. And then I found some roommates and we rented an apartment on a Riverside Drive.
When you came here, what did you do?
I found a job in my field. I worked for Ladies' Home Journal, actually, in a sort of an editorial assistant capacity. But I didn't like that job at all because it was not what I was accustomed to. It was not newspaper reporting. So I found a job. I only stayed a few months. I found a job with a literary agent working on manuscripts, and that was so-so. And then I ended up on Photoplay magazine as their story editor, which was a much more challenging job, closer to what I was good at. I would take the manuscripts and work with them, and also do some of my own stories. And then I met somebody who I eventually married, and we went back to London, got married and came back here. And that essentially was what happened at the beginning. And then when I had children, I stopped working full-time and went and did a freelance correspondence sort of work for various people who I'd known in the business. And that lasted, gosh, I'm not quite sure how many years. And then we went to London because my husband had some work over there. We went for 3 years, went back to London, which he'd always wanted to do anyway. And while I was there, I fulfilled another ambition. I ran for a seat on the local council. It wasn't local as in town. Here it was local as in state, what you would call states. We had counties, not states, in England. And I ran for office and won, and then about a year later we had to come back, gave up my seat, was asked to help aspiring women candidates here get into office because it was the height of a very lively women's movement at the time. This was now the beginning of the 70s when that was in full swing. And I also wanted to get back into journalism very much, and the New York Times was opening a Connecticut section and a Westchester section and a Long Island section and so on and so forth. And I decided that would be very useful because maybe I could do that work without commuting. The question was, how do I reach them, because that's not so easy. So I used all of my techniques, I will put it that way, to get a chance. And it was a remarkable chance because within 6 weeks they realized they had a very seasoned British newspaper person, not sort of like a writer, a really seasoned news gatherer. And they gave me my own column in that section, which I had for, gosh, that would have been about 74, 75. I had for about 6 years. Then I went on to the main paper and stayed with them altogether about 18 years, doing a lot of stuff, doing the column, the real estate, personal finance, we did consumer stuff, I did education, a little bit of everything. And I did some pieces for the magazine. I mean, just a lot of stuff. And again, I got involved in training women wanting to be involved in the political process, in media skills. And you know, one thing leads to another. And then. I wanted to really find a way of training these women which wasn't ad hoc. At the time it was ad hoc. If you belonged to a feminist group and they were running a training session, you know, you signed up for the weekend. It was usually in a hotel. That seemed to me totally inadequate because most of the women, or a lot of the women who wanted to get into politics weren't interested in the women's movement, hadn't membership in any of those, and weren't aware of any of these training sessions. Even though they said they promoted them, they really didn't. I wanted to put it on a much more solid basis, rather like changing over from a chartered flight to a scheduled flight. You knew it would be, these classes would be available at a place at a certain time. And if you want to come this year and you want to go 2 years from now, you knew where to go. And it had nothing to do with who you joined or what you were or anything. And after many false starts, I managed to get it started at Yale. I don't believe in starting at the bottom. It takes too long to get to the top. You better as well start at the top, because otherwise you don't have time to fit it into your life. And I had recently been appointed an associate fellow there in connection with my work in journalism, so I had some contacts there. And we started a non-profit campus organization. We could not be, and I didn't want to be, academic. I had very clear ideas of what I wanted the school to do. Training should be from consultants who are working in the field, or prior candidates coming and talking. Very short sessions, so most of these women could not leave their jobs or their families for more than 5 days, 6 days. So we had to do concentrated training, which we've done. And then we did weekends throughout the year, and we did summer programs. And we're still there. It has not grown the way I'd hoped it would for lots of reasons, but it's still there. It's very highly regarded. And we have two of our graduates now in Congress. One is Gabby Giffords, who is a board member now. And another one is the woman in New York State. I'm just blanking out. It'll come to me.
By the way, you mentioned that you moved back from London.
Yes.
After your husband's stint there. Where did you move?
Here. That's when we bought a home for now, almost 40 years.
And your children, how many children do you have?
Oh, I have 2 children. I have a boy and a girl. They are now all grown up, They're in their 40s. One is living in Olympia, Washington. She is the state historic preservation officer there. And the other one is a boy, a man now, in his 40s too. He's in Singapore. He developed a business there in TV, in post-production. Post-production is where programs are taken from the raw footage and put them into a packaged program.
Grandchildren?
I have two from my daughter, and they are now in their late teens. One is in college. Two girls.
Okay, so you had this wonderful initiative at Yale, and you are still involved in that, you say?
No, I'm not. I'm not. I was involved as the founder and president for 3 years, almost 4 years, and then I stepped back for a lot of reasons, and I left it. I'm still nominally a emeritus, I suppose you would call it, in academia, but I don't have any active role in it. But I still follow it and do what I can.
Now, why did you move to Westport? Why not to another town?
Like everything else in life, it's serendipity. We were returning at the beginning of the summer, and so the first thing we decided was that if we went back to New York, we'd better just get somewhere for the summer and then go back later, because of not being with two small children in the city in the summer. My husband had come back before me, and I know through a friend said, why don't you try Westport? They were going there. I mean, it was just one of those serendipitous things. So I found something for the summer for a couple of months rental, and we came here, and then we started looking for a more permanent place. And New York at the time was becoming very difficult to live in. It was going downhill at that point. And the kids, well, it wasn't, you know, it was difficult for the kids and for everything in general. And in the end, we decided we maybe shouldn't go back into the city until they're a bit older. So we were looking around at possible places, and truthfully, everywhere I looked, I couldn't find anything that would give me anything better than here. It's a good commute, and where his office was only 5 minutes from Grand Central. It has, as you know, all of the amenities. It had the beach. It had good schools. And from a Jewish point of view, if you're looking at, because it's a Jewish thing, it had a Jewish community, which Darien didn't and New Canaan didn't at the time. And so that also made it attractive, because they were at the age where they were going to Hebrew school. So otherwise we would have had to take them to another town. So that was convenient. So it all fitted together, and the prices were about the same. It was a lot more attractive than going to Long Island, which I really didn't like, or New Jersey, which I liked less. And Westchester was an option, but the taxes at the time were a lot higher in Westchester. Certainly on Long Island they were. So, you make a decision, and in the end, everything came back to, well, we kind of like it here, so why don't we just stay?
What was your husband's profession?
He was an entertainment lawyer. He was for 10 years the counsel for Actors' Equity. So we had a lot to do with the theatre. No, he did, not me so much.
What was Westport like when you moved here?
Very different to today, very, very different, as you must know. It was more artsy. It was more modest. People didn't have nearly the kind of money that they have here today. I think it was more suburban-ish of the 70s and 80s, which meant that the families were not quite as arrogant as they are today. I think we were more, in every way, we were kind of more mainstream. people didn't have the ambitions or the money that they have now. And you didn't see the service economy that you see here today. If you had your lawn mowed, it was by the neighbor's teenager, not by service. Here it's all service now. If you had people over to dinner, you did the cooking and the cleaning up as well. And if you had that it was much more, you know, we were of ourselves. There was not that kind of hierarchy and status that there is today here, or the idea that if you had this home, you probably had another one or two other homes as well. It was much more of the what they call now mid-century America. Its values were very different, and that's something that has changed tremendously. Values were very, very different. I think they were more homespun in a naive sort of way. I really do think they were more homespun. What meant something to people was very different what means to these people who live here today. I'll give you one example. Fences, to me, is a very symbolic example. Today, everywhere you turn, when you drive around town, people are putting up fences. And I remember this very clearly because I grew up in England where there were always hedges and fences between the houses. It was just the way we built the homes. Here, one of the most dramatic changes was that you never quite knew where your backyard ended and the other one started. It was just part of the same lawn or trees or bank or hillside or whatever. Yet here, it all ran into one, and there was no sense of being separated from your neighbor. And I think if fences makes good neighbors, as has been said, they also separate. And today the fear is always, well, why don't you have a security system? Why don't you have a fence? And yet, I remember most people didn't even, at the beginning, bother to lock their houses. They didn't lock their doors. And I don't remember talking about security systems. I don't even remember it coming up in conversation. Nobody cared, because there was nothing to lose. I mean, you didn't have anything, anybody really wanted to take, maybe an old black and white TV, but even that you wouldn't want to take. So there was that sort of, and truly, and I swear this happened, almost like in the movies today, when you go back to the old movies, I came in and the next day the neighbor knocked on the door with a cake. Truly. I don't know of any neighbor who would knock on the door with a cake today. I think maybe the door wouldn't be answered, or the security system would start blaring, or they would think you were a nut. So there was that mid-century American Leave It to Beaver sort of a feel on a sophisticated level, because a lot of these people were quite renowned in their own field, whether as artists. We still had the two organizations in Westport was great artists. There was great artists and there were great writers, workshops. There was two organizations. They were still going. In fact, we bought the house from the fellow here who was very ill when he sold it. He and his wife, he had developed and written The Shadow, which I understand was a great radio show in this country. If you go back to the 40s, The Shadow knows. They say, oh, you must have known The Shadow. I didn't know The Shadow, but he was the Shadow Man. But he was, they were very ordinary, nice people. The synagogue, if this is for the Jewish audience, let's get on to the Jewish, because what I didn't end up explain what I did is that after I finished with journalism, I went into, as you know, about 16 years of Jewish history and Jewish history research and Jewish history writing and on and on. The synagogue here was similarly small. I don't think we had more than about 400 or 500 families at most, one synagogue at the time. And again, it had a different feel, totally. There were far fewer programs. We didn't even have a full-time cantor at the synagogue. It was so small. And the Rabbi Rubenstein was the guy who was noted for having gone to jail when he marched in the civil rights marches with Martin Luther King, who he had here. I mean, that was the kind of Jewish community. They were very much activists in a social way, not a Jewish way. They were part of the civil rights movement, and the people here were very politically involved. That I do remember, as well as being from the arts community. They were extremely political. The original people who lived in Westport, and I think it was kind of known for that. So he was sort of fitted in when he went down and marched, and he went to jail for a weekend or something, and he brought some of those people up here. So that was the kind of socially involved community from a Jewish standpoint that was there. Today, that's gone. That's gone. It's more the hedge fund guys, the Wall Street guys who are here, and social action is sort of ho-hum. Social action was deeply important to those people. I mean, really important to those people, in a way which it's sort of almost pro forma now, or obligatory, but it had a different feel. It had a much more sincere feel at those days.
You mentioned, if we back up a little, if you don't mind, you mentioned that you went to school somewhere in the countryside during World War II?
Not the countryside. I wasn't one of those children that was brought over from Germany. I was born in London. So we, as a family, which was very typical, had moved north. A lot of the families in London at that time, if they could, they moved out of the range of the bombs. The bombers couldn't go any further than, I don't know what the line was, but it was very common for you to move a family north of the bombing line. The bombing line kept extending as their technology got better during the war, but we were north of that line. When we first we went to the Midlands, to Leicester, where a lot of my father's cronies, because he was not English, he was from Greece, he was from Salonika. His cronies had gone, so he moved with his cronies. It's the old ethnic migrations that we know so well about. So he'd gone north, and luckily, because I understand that about a week or two after we left our house, it was bombed. I was much too little to really follow that, but that's what I understand. And then the bombers caught up with us, because I remember going to the shelter at night. I remember the sound of the bombers. I remember the sound of the all clear. I remember it. I do remember. I remember going to school, and one day you marched to school and the building was there. The next day you marched to school and the building wasn't there. So the bombs eventually caught up with us, but we didn't move again.
Your father, you mentioned, was from Greece. Was your mother also from Greece?
No. Mother, very different. My father was from a Sephardic family in Salonika, very typically Sephardic, and Eastern Mediterranean, which is not Eastern European, it's Eastern Mediterranean. They are very much Turkish. I mean, he was an old Turk. If you call him an old Turk, that was my father, a real old Turk, with his Turkish coffee and his ways and his attitude towards women. It was very much, they were very different people from the Eastern European Ashkenazi Jews, who were much more intellectual. They were much more religious. These were the merchant Jews. These were they were much, as he says, he didn't grow up with any, knowing what anti-Semitism was. He never had any idea that it existed where he lived. I mean, just didn't. And he always said that. I mean, he was a much more sophisticated man of the world type, rather than a Jewish type in the traditional sense. And then his family had moved on to Istanbul and then to Paris in the 20s. And it was in Paris in the 20s that he met my mother. She was from a French family. They had moved to England and only a few years before. And she had grown up in London and had been coming to Paris regularly to see relatives, and also because she had started a business. It was extraordinary. I'm just looking into it. It's amazing at 18 or 19, she had a millinery business where she made hats. She went to the collections in Paris to get the design, taking a designer with her. Had premises, Great Portland Street, where the fashion industry is in London. And it's a very interesting, historically this is worthwhile knowing about. And I wanted to know, and I just looking into it just a few years ago, how did she get the capital? Why was she on her own in a partnership actually with her sister, one of her sisters who was very, very fashionable? Why were they in this business? How did they get into this business? How did they, manage to develop it as such as, I mean, today kids like this are just getting out of high school. They were already running a sophisticated business, and in fact, going back to London a few months ago, I got an ad from a fashion weekly, like a Women's Wear Daily sort of thing, where they had advertised their hats, and so I was looking into it, and I've come to the conclusion that it's possibly because in the 20s it was still very hard for a woman to have a profession or get hired professionally. And knowing my grandmother, who was her mother, who was a very militant woman who broke all barriers, she wasn't all conventional. She wouldn't have wanted her children to go as a seamstress, which was one of the things they would do, or that sort of thing. She would have said, my daughters, never, they're not going to be. She would tell me, she would always wag her finger and say, you're not going to be anybody's doormat. That was her, in her French accent, no doormat, no doormat. All right, Grandma, I won't be a doormat. But so I suppose she didn't want her daughters to be a doormat, so the only way they couldn't be a doormat was if they had their own business. And she apparently got some capital from her husband's side of the family that had some money. She had been married to, they were very unconventional people. My grandfather was an impresario who had nightclubs in the centre of London, and they lived over the theatre, in the theatre district. They lived in an apartment over one of the restaurants that he had. And I can't think of anywhere I would think less likely to bring up 3 daughters than in the theatre district at the time. It's right off of Piccadilly Circus. I mean, you really bring up daughters right off of Piccadilly Circus. It was very unusual. I mean, they weren't the nice Jewish family of renown or of tradition. They were a little bit, to say the least, unusual. And he knew everybody in show business. And he sent them to boarding school, I think, for this reason, because it was not exactly the most salubrious neighborhood to have your children running around. And so that's where she grew up, and then she met so, when it came to why were they doing it, because they were an unconventional family. I mean, why, what, you want to go into business, you're 18 years old, fine, we'll, find you some money, we'll find you some premises. And they did very well. And apparently, and while she was in Paris one time, she met my father. And I remember that the story was in family law, which is an interesting Jewish family law, that they were worried to a certain extent that it wouldn't be very proper, because his mother was a very proper Salonika lady who didn't even do her own shopping. These women were very sheltered in that Turkish milieu that they lived in or grew up in, the Ottoman Empire, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, who wouldn't even go to market. The men went to market, meeting this sort of liberated 1920s, almost flapper girl. And they weren't sure that the mother would see that as a good idea, even though they were both Jewish. The difference was huge, and she did not come from a Sephardic. Well, no, her grandfather was from Palestine, so he must have been Sephardic originally, the grandparents. But the family had come from Alsace-Lorraine to Paris. But they had we always talk about the fashion shop in Paris. They had they sold clothes. But I have to show you, it's on the wall there. Maybe it's good if you want to turn off that for a second or edit it. I will bring in the picture of this we used to say the great couture shop on the Rue de Grenelle, and you'll have a good laugh.
We'll do that at...
So that is my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather. They were, he was from Palestine and she was from Alsace-Lorraine. They met in Paris. He had been brought to Paris by the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the great educational organization, French organization at that point in history, the beginning of the 20th century, because he was an aspiring student who was smart enough and they wanted to give him some opportunities. So they met in Paris and lived in Paris. Okay, this is the so-called couture house on the Rue de Grenelle that they had, which of course is a second-hand clothes store. How do we know it was second-hand clothes? And some of them are standing in front of it because at that time, knowing the history myself, you had your clothes made. You still had your clothes made. You didn't have ready to wear. And so if they had clothes to sell, they must have been second-hand clothes. There's no question about it, in my mind anyway. And that was the place where my grandmother, on my mother's side, grew up in Paris. This is London. And in the 1920s, and my parents are getting married. It may have been also the early 30s. My Salonika family is on the left. The French grandma is on the right, and they're sort of brothers-in-law and so forth there. But that is in London. And the two sisters of my mother are standing next to her as maids of honor. Okay. This is Grandpa George. His name was George. Actually, he wasn't born George, but that was the name everyone knew him as, George. He was the impresario, the man about town, the boulevardier, the guy who ran nightclubs and restaurants, and was very much into the theatre and emerging movie world of the 1920s. He died very young of asthma.
I know that you mentioned that your father was Sephardic. Now, were you brought up Sephardic or Ashkenazi?
Sephardic.
Sephardic. And however, when you came to Westport, you didn't find a Sephardic synagogue.
I don't know that I would have been a part of the Sephardic world, even if there'd been one here. Most Sephardim do not join Sephardic synagogues. There is a very, even more so today, it depends on where you came from. The Iranians join the Iranian synagogues, the Syrians join the Syrian synagogues. It's not quite the same thing. Sephardic is a catch-all phrase that has been used to describe anybody who's an Ashkenazi. And historically, and even in contemporary life, it really is misleading. So no, I would have joined the local synagogue, and we had no choice whether it was conservative or reform. Here it was the Reform synagogue, but they had everybody because it was the only game in town, which you probably remember.
Now, as far as being Jewish in this area, how was it for you in Westport? How was it generally for the Jews? How was the reception?
We had been told to be very cautious because until about 20 years before we came, some of it was truly restricted. Connecticut was not wide open, as you know, and the Jews, if they were here, had lived in very tight pockets. There was a pocket in Stamford, there was a pocket in Norwalk, there was a pocket in Bridgeport, but they hadn't scattered and really become part of the landscape. So we were coming to a place where there was a Jewish community, but it was small. It was so small that for the first few years the kids went to school on the Jewish holidays. The schools were open. Now they're closed, but they weren't then. I don't remember them being closed at all. we were a very small minority at that point. It was not a Jewish area. Today it's become much, much more of a Jewish area. In fact, it's almost noted for that. Westport is now. And as you know, we have 3 synagogues, not just one. So it has changed. Was there any discrimination or feeling of discrimination? No, I never felt anything at all here, no. But maybe because it was always known as a very liberal place. Westport, I mean, compared to a New Canaan or a Darien. And it remains so today.
And your children went to, you mentioned Temple Israel Hebrew school, but they also must have gone to the public schools. How was the public school at
Public
that time?
schools were good. Well, my daughter was already in high school when we got here. She hated Staples. I mean, if we talked about whether she would ever be wanted to reincarnated, she would say she'd be reincarnated provided she doesn't have to go back to Staples. She really, really did not get along there. It was already a place where the girls were very well dressed, and she was sort of not into clothes at that point. It was where they were already getting into status, and she wasn't into that. She'd not really come from that. And I think that she felt most uncomfortable there. She was not at all happy. She didn't fit into the social world that she found. Though she liked the studies, she found that the teachers were wonderful, and she still remembers some of them with great affection and learnt a lot. My son was, I don't know, maybe because he came here in the 3rd grade, he was already used to school. He didn't like Coleytown at all. He found it at the time very difficult, but if you aren't really part of an in-crowd in middle school, they can really be brutal. And I think it was so bad that he didn't want us to go to school at some point. So he had terrible, terrible memories of Coleytown. But when he got into Staples, he found his niche. And they were the radio club. They were the original techies. You know, in his day, the techies got murdered because they weren't the football guys. They were made fun of, they were looked down upon, and who really won the war but the techies today? I mean, with all his techiness, I mean, he's built a very, very, flourishing business. And a lot of his pals ended up on Microsoft, you know, and all of those places in the earliest days. So while they might have had a hard time in school, they ended up having a very good time in life. They were with the right skills at the right time. But back then we didn't know it. And but his high school days were he remembers them fondly. I mean, with his techie crowd, and they had a radio club, and they had a couple of teachers who enjoyed them. So I think he had a pretty good high school Staples experience relative to my daughter.
Now, going back to your career, continue with what you were doing.
When they were in high school?
Well, you left off at a certain point.
Oh, what
so
I was
just-
doing. What
yes.
I was doing. Oh, yes. Well, I was doing this stuff at the Times, thoroughly enjoying it, loving, because I absolutely love newspaper work. I never was very good with magazines. For some reason, I found magazines very difficult to cope with. But newspaper work, big, quick turnaround, quick learning curve for the topic, writing it up, getting it out. That was my strength, and recognizing a story. I mean, there was always a feeling back down there that if you sent Andrée to do anything, she'd come back with 3 stories, not 1. Which was true. I used to know for news, it's a sense of news that never leaves you. And I miss it. So I was really a news person, deep down. And then I realized that time was going on, time was a-wasting. There were 2 things I needed to do before I felt maybe I wouldn't have any time to do anything else. One of them was to start this program at Yale, well, I didn't know it was going to be Yale yet when I started it, but when I did start it, and we got ourselves up and running, there was the fear among, at least within an editor that I was working with, that because we would need to raise money, that it would be possibly a concern that there would be a quid pro quo, that people would try to get their name into print and, you know, give me a donation. There was, it would tarnish my reputation. So I felt very ambivalent. I didn't want to leave. On the other hand, I realized that I couldn't do what I needed to do if I started the school and continue. I could do occasional pieces, but the impression would be at one point that people were looking for favors, and I'd had an incredible reputation. I didn't want to hurt it. So there was only one thing to do. Since the school was taking an enormous amount of my time to develop, not that I was getting any money for it, and not that I ever have, but I couldn't, it was a conflict of interest. So I waited 9 months before I quit, because I had a very successful column, and I knew I couldn't get it back. You know, once it's gone, it's gone. It's not like you knock on the door and say, please, can I come home? I can't go home again. So I quit, and it was a trauma. It was a trauma to quit. It was a tremendous trauma professionally, because personally, we always used to say, well, you know, all these friends are only your friends because of what you do. And you see, as soon as you stop what you're doing, they won't be there anymore. So I was all braced for that, and I was not braced for how fast it happened. I mean, it was like the curtain fell, or the light bulb went off. One day, you know, the phone was ringing, and because we didn't have email in those days, the phones would be ringing and the mail would be coming in, and you got invitations to there, and there. You know, every day of the week there was 10 invitations. To somebody just pulled down the curtain. No invitations, no phone calls, a silence. The silence was deafening and fast. I think within 6 weeks the silence prevailed. Plus, whatever I was doing, nobody would return my phone calls anymore. I was a nobody. I didn't have any standing. I was looking for support for the program and so I was the buyer, not the seller. Well, wait a minute, I'm the seller, not the buyer here. But whatever it was, I was in the position where instead of having something that everybody wanted, which was you know, a mention or a story that they wanted in the paper, but they used to come to me constantly with, I was there looking for support and money and work, people to help me do the job. And when you start something where I've talked about this once when I was given a Pioneer Award. One thing about being a pioneer is that you have to understand you're going to face ridicule. You have to understand that no one is going to really take you seriously. And you can't expect the world to follow in your footsteps and say, bravo. That comes much later, if it comes at all. You have to do it for its own sake, because you believe in it, because you think it's worthwhile, and you have to say, I know that, I mean, this has happened to me so many times in my life, but with the school that happened immediately. I had to beg people, beg all the way around. And we started, and also the other problem was that to be accepted at Yale, even as a campus organization, we had to maintain certain standards. Otherwise they could just kick us off with no notice. You know, one letter and we would be kicked off of campus. There was no, you know, arbitration hearing or anything like that. We were allowed at the pleasure of the university, which meant that, you know, they could stop us any time or kick us out. And that bothered me, because the board that I got didn't understand quite that, because the board of the school were not connected to Yale. They were all political people. And although we had a good board, we had the 3 congresswomen in Connecticut very early on. We leveraged those, but still they didn't understand, and we had at one time a big problem with that, because one of our board members in charge of curriculum and students didn't realize how important that was. And so that was a very, very difficult transition for the school, and remained so for many, many years. And I think it's still an issue, that they have to realise that where they are at the pleasure of the campus. Although we've been there now so long, we're under the law school now. And they've had us so long, I think that, you know, a few little missteps wouldn't be quite as bad as it was at the very beginning. So I went on and I did that. And then the man I was living with got very sick, and I couldn't look after him and run the program. And anyway, I knew I'd have to step back at some point, because when you start an organization, if that organization is you, it will not outlast you. You have to turn it over at some point in order for it to, it's like a child. You know, you have to let it go, because it's got to stand on its own feet, own 2 feet. So I said, all right, I'll let it go, I'll let it stand on its own 2 feet, and we had a very, very shaky few years. After that, when I left that, I then went on and did the other thing that I wanted to do, which fits in with your Jewish Historical Society, which was I wanted to develop programs in Jewish history, particularly Sephardic Jewish history, which was totally ignored in most of the congregational schools, the Hebrew schools and the day schools. And that had been triggered because some cousins of mine in London had invited me to a conference at that point in time. And one of the things, some of the delegates to this conference, it was a conference on the Judeo-Spanish language, the Ladino language, but it was far broader than that. It was held under the auspices of the University of London. And what they were saying, the delegates from America particularly, and it really hit home to me, was that they couldn't teach either the language or the history or anything, because the kind of teachers that they had no clue. They didn't know the subject, they had no materials to work with, so, you know, they just didn't do it. So, I decided that maybe it was time to really do something else that was meaningful rather than professional, because I got myself into a financial position where I didn't have to worry too much about income. I would do a curriculum for the children. How do I do it? I hadn't a clue. I'd never done learning materials in my life. I had nowhere to start. I mean, same as the school. I'd never formed a corporation, never formed a non-profit, never run a non-profit, but it needed to be done, so you learn how to do it, and you did it. You made mistakes, of course you made mistakes, but you did it. So I did the same thing, and went to see, at that point, Rabbi Orkand at Temple Israel, and I said, look, I want to give you something to develop this, because I don't think I can do it. So I offered him a relatively small, well, not so small, donation, because my father had died, and I thought I'd take a little bit of what he had left and use it for this sort of community purpose. He sat on it for a year, did nothing. Every time I went to see him, he said, yes, 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 I'm thinking about it. Well, after thinking about it for a year, I figured I'd give him long enough to think. And so I said, look, I've just given up the major work I was doing on the school. I've got a time now to devote a little bit. Can I take it over? So I took it over. And we formed a committee. We raised some more money from a foundation in LA. And we created a full-scale curriculum called Out of Spain, which is still selling, with 4 books for children in school class books, like textbooks, you know, they're text and workbooks all combined, which is what the teachers said they needed. We have a DVD and we have a CD, a music CD that goes. So it's a whole program of learning, and we developed it the way the teachers said they wanted. They wanted modular, so they could take a lesson here and there and not have to do a whole series, because they didn't have time. They never had time. It is, I think I must have sold it now to about, I'm not sure if it's 600 or 700. It's really, really widely sold and widely used. 600 or 700 sales by now in schools. I don't know if they're all using it, if they're using it a little bit, if they're just using the video, if they're just using a few lessons. It doesn't matter. It is being used. And after that, in order to do that, I had to form a team. I needed somebody to do the video because I'm not a video producer. I needed somebody to do the music CD because I'm not a musician. I needed somebody to do the lessons because I wasn't a classroom teacher with a background in classroom teacher. And so as I put together the team, I had to also learn the subject. How could I edit the lessons? How could I edit the video? How could I oversee the project if I didn't understand intrinsically what the subject matter had to be? Why we chose this over that? You know, you really had to have a full knowledge of the subject. So I began again to throw myself into learning about the subject. I didn't know a thing, truthfully, until 1995. I was almost totally ignorant and in this area, and I learned Jewish history. And as I got into Jewish history, one thing led to another. There was a wonderful rabbi scholar from Hebrew University who was taking groups of scholars to various countries on study tours. We went to the south of France, we went to Sicily, we went to Italy, we went to Morocco. I mean, we've been for 10 years now, I've studied and traveled with him and his so-called, you know, acolytes, if you will. I learned more and more, and as I did more and more, then I did articles in some of the Jewish magazines, and then I started to do lectures because I'd done a lot of lecturing when I did my first book, which had nothing to do with Jews. It was called Children of Fast-Track Parents. It was about overprivileged kids who lived in places like this. That came out of work I did at the Times, actually, when I was doing a column there called Relationships. And so I was very comfortable on the lecture circuit. And the more I knew, the more I branched out and learnt more. And then I took a very unusual take on Jewish history, and I didn't realize that I was doing this. I was taking all the stories that nobody else bothers with. I'd taken an approach to Jewish history which was not coming from an academic Jewish studies sort of a background or even a rabbinic background. It was coming to Jewish history as the history of a people. What had happened to them. And I realized that really 99% of what has happened to them over the years, post-biblical, has never really been studied by lay people. They concentrate on one or two topics, like Israel or the Holocaust, and they seem to eliminate 90%, 99% of Jewish history. So I concentrated on things they didn't bother about. The history, the miracle history of the Jews of the Caribbean, the history of the Renaissance in Italy, where I did my book, the history of the Jewish involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution, where I did my book about the spy. We've gone on from that, you know, it's filtered out. And then I started putting each of these themes together and doing mini courses, like On the Road with Jewish Merchants, and talk about what was happening. So that's how I come to the Jewish history. It's a long way of saying it, but coming to it little by little by little, and then putting all the strands together, which is where I am today.
But you have written a few books, and
Yes.
I know one about a famous Jewish woman. Tell us about that.
Oh, that's called The Woman Who Defied Kings.
Mm-hmm.
That was a woman banker of the 16th century who inherited one of the biggest banks in Europe, international banks bigger in its own way than Rothschild's would be later. And she took her money and her position to build an escape network to save the victims of the Inquisition. That we're now working on, hopefully, a movie. Whether it'll come to pass, we don't know, but we're at the beginning stages of that. And I would love to see it come to the screen or as a miniseries on TV, which it probably will be, a sort of an HBO miniseries, because I don't think that it can really flourish unless it gets into the... You see, I'm from the regular media. I'm not from the Jewish media, which gives me an understanding of the media in a way perhaps others have not had. And we're working on that. And I'd like to see my Russian book about the spy, the Russian Dance it's called. It's a very romantic thriller. Also become a movie, and I'm working to try and make that happen. And so that's the story of the woman. But that was an 8-year research project, I mean in God knows how many countries, to try to tease out material from the 16th century. I'd never done 16th century academic research in my life. I didn't know how to do it, I didn't know where to start. Like forming a company, I mean, if you don't know where to start and how to do it, you just say, oh, I'm going to do it. And then you pick up the expertise as you go along. And you find people and places and so forth, and you learn. You learn the same way you might learn if you took a course. And I learned how to do academic research and how to do 16th century research. Must admit, I did it maybe in a little less formalized fashion than I should have done had I. But you know, one thing's interesting. I guess sometimes if you'd gone to school for some of this, you would have been inhibited because you would have felt, well, that's not the way to do it. This is the way I was taught. Well, I wasn't taught, so I could do it either way. If that didn't work, so I tried it this way. That didn't work, I tried something else. And in the end, got dozens upon dozens of papers together. Now, for posterity, the papers and all of the research materials that we got from the archives in Europe connected with Donna Gracia Nassi, the 16th century woman, have been donated to the American Sephardi Federation at the Center for Jewish History in New York. That's where they reside now. The research materials that we got for the Russian book on the Bolshevik Revolution and the aftermath, they were bought by the Tenement Library at NYU, which is the left-wing library of all left-wing. I didn't even know there was a left-wing library. I mean, you gotta be kind of a little bit adventurous. I wanted to give it to a library. I didn't know where to start, and then one day I saw in the New York Times that this library had just acquired the papers of the American Communist Association. They'd gone out of business. They didn't know where to put the boxes of stuff they had. Nobody wanted them. It was the height of the boom. Who wants a communist? So they'd given them all to this left-wing library. And I thought, well, maybe he'd be interested in what I've got as well, since mine borders a little on the theatrical world. So I noted his name and then looked him up on the internet and found his phone number and email. And I said, oh, well, I'll just try and phone him up. And he's not even going to want to speak to me. So I just phoned him up cold. And I said who I was. And I said, please, you know, I know this sounds crazy, but I've got all these papers and I know you're the right kind of library. And so we had a little chat and he said, well, let me look and see your book. I'll find it in our library, and if I feel it covers the material that we want, I'll get back to you in about a month. All right, so I put down the phone, went about my business. By 4 o'clock the same afternoon, he said, I went over to the library at lunch. I couldn't stop reading the book. This is Russian. I almost finished it. He said, absolutely, I want those boxes that you have. So that's now at the Tenement Library, Tamiment Library at NYU. So I've begun to give away my research materials. Now
this may not be relevant, but a while ago you called me about an event that happened in Hungary,
yes.
where the women murdered
yes.
their husbands.
Yes. Yes, that was something I was going to do, and then I called to that. I kind of didn't like them in the end. You know, you look at certain topics and you see whether you want to pursue them. I didn't like them in the end. I really didn't. I understood why they did what they did, and it was actually for the right kind of reasons. I mean, you know, if you can murder anybody for the right kind of reasons, the reasons were right. I mean, I understood what they were trying to achieve, but I didn't like them. I just, there was something about them I did not like. And I know there was a lot of material, and I could have got it in the medical library at Yale. You remember that?
I did go to the medical library for you, and I met your friend there. I don't know if he's still alive.
He is.
George somebody.
Yes. He is, but his wife, who was a very vivacious woman, she died recently. But he's still around. I met him recently. Yes, he's still around. Very interesting man. He was the librarian.
Yes, and he showed me some enormous archives, and I did go through some of them, and I reported to you, but then you decided not to.
I decided not to go. It was too difficult, and I didn't really, in the end, like them. And if you know, there's a lot of people who start even biographies of of people. And I mean, they told me, many of them, that they start a biography of somebody and they really find they just don't take to this person at all, you know, for whatever reason, and they feel they just don't want to go on. Even though it may be an interesting story, they don't take to that person, and I can understand that. I really didn't think that I would want to do the work. I mean, I hadn't even tried to sell it or anything at that point. I got enough in that I said no, this isn't for me. Maybe for somebody else, but it's not for me.
By the way, what happened to your husband?
My husband decided, he had a midlife crisis and decided everything was, you know, typical. He had better things to do.
Is he still alive?
Yeah, he's still alive, but he had a very difficult time. Very difficult time. He didn't do so well, and now he's very ill. He's in New York, but he's very ill. So he left. So he decided onwards. I'll tell you one of the things, and this maybe is worth recording. I had been the conventional wife for years. I mean, we were married for 26 years, and I'd brought up the children, and I'd kept the home, and done all the things that a mid-century American or any wife was supposed to do, you know, the traditional role. I played it well, reasonably well. And then all of a sudden he sees this helpmate suddenly become more important than he was. I was doing this and it worked, and I was doing that and it worked, and I think that also undermined him, because he was having a shaky time in his own life, professionally, in the law. He shouldn't have had, but he was. And it was, the contrast was too much. And also, it was the time, this was the 80s, the early 80s. If you go back to that time, you will see there was a whole rash of men, particularly, even more than the women, who suddenly felt that they had settled down before the whole sex revolution, the whole social revolution, the women's, whatever it was, the whole, 60s phenomenon, and they kind of missed the party. And they were, I mean, it was a whole rash. It was like a disease, like a virus that was affecting a lot of people in these towns at the time. We're talking of the local. And it was all over the place. I mean, all these, particularly the men who somehow felt they'd missed the party, and they wanted to get to the party before it was over. And I think that was part of it too. I mean, he just thought everything else was just better. This was now, oh dear, I've been married for, I need to fly. And so he left. But it turned out that it, as they've now know, I mean, today we're much more seasoned on that, and nobody kind of breaks anything up expecting everything outside to be glorious anymore. They've realized what they have. I think that's changed. The attitudes have changed.
Is there anything else you would like to add to this recording?
Oh, I think I've talked much too long. No, nothing unless you've got a question you want to ask me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for asking, thank you for having me, and thank you for thinking of me.